Last year, I called the original Ronbus Ripple the best paddle I'd ever used, and I was extremely excited to see it be released to the general public. Unfortunately, it ultimately failed to get USAP approval, so Ronbus renamed that version of the Ripple the Beta. Now finally, 8 months later, we have the final approved version that Ronbus is calling the Ripple V2. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So when I tested the original Beta Ripple, I was so blown away by its playability that I really thought that paddle would change the pickleball landscape forever. The spin, the power, and especially the feel were on a whole different level to other paddles I'd tested, even other foam power paddles, and I was so disappointed to find out that it hadn't been properly tested for approval. It bummed me out not only because that meant most people wouldn't be able to experience that paddle's playability, but also because that meant that something about its magic wasn't allowed. Even 8 months later, no paddle has impressed me as much as the Beta Ripple did. The Yola Pro 4s are probably the closest anything's ever come, but as you can imagine, when I finally got this Ripple V2 for testing, I was pretty excited. Now I've put this paddle through an extensive test. I've had it for about a month, and one thing you'll notice is that I've got a lot more doubles footage throughout this review. I know a lot of you have been asking me to do more paddle testing in doubles settings because you can relate to it more. Now, for the record, I do think that I can thoroughly test a paddle by playing singles, but I will be including more doubles footage going forward. Now, the big thing I was curious about with the Ripple V2 was, is it as good as the Beta? And if it's not, is it at least similar enough to where it's the closest paddle you can find? I will talk about that throughout this review, but of course, because not everyone got to test the Beta Ripple, I will talk about this paddle on its own merit as well, and I will also compare it to other comparable paddles in the industry right now. Now, before we go on, I do want to remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So let's talk specs and technology on the Ripple V2, and I'm going to talk about all three shapes today, the R1, the R2, and the brand new R4 hybrid shape. But I'm also going to be honest and say that I spent about 90% of my time on court with the R1. You guys know me, I tend to prefer longer paddles, so let's get into the specs. The R1 Ripple is 16.5 inches long, it weighs 8.2 ounces plus or minus 0.2 ounces, and it has a 5.5 inch handle. It has the AeroCurve elongated shape instead of the more standard one you'll find on a Perseus or a Carbon 1 or even Ronbus's R3, which unfortunately we aren't getting as a Ripple, at least not for the time being. Now let's talk swing weight and twist weight. The twist weight is 5.89 and the swing weight is really high. 124, which is pretty much the highest you'll find for any paddle in stock form. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if its playability is perfect right out of the box, but if it does require some weight for increased stability, which is quite common on power paddles, that could become a bit of an issue. Moving on to the R2, this is a standard length paddle, so it's 16 inches long. It also weighs 8.2 ounces, give or take 0.2. It has a 5-inch handle, 6.56 twist weight, and a 1/16 swing weight, which yes, is quite high for a standard paddle. The R4 is a hybrid shaped paddle, the first one from Ronbus. It's 16.25 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle. It weighs 8 ounces plus or minus 0.2 ounces and has a 5.87 twist weight and a 117 swing weight. That's probably the most standard swing weight relative to paddle shape out of the three, but it is still quite high, so just keep that in mind. Now all of these handles are 4 1/8 inches in circumference with an octagonal shape, and I will talk about these handles a little bit more in the maneuverability section because I do have a few pet peeves here. Squish, squish, squish. More on that later. Now let's talk technology. The Ripple has Ronbus's 4th generation Fire core. Fire stands for fiber infused rebounding elastomer. It has EVA foam on the sides and then a woven 3K carbon infused with foam making up the center of the paddle. This core is similar enough in design to the Beta Ripple, but with a bit more reinforcement throughout the center to make it past that PB core certification. Chris from Pickleball Studio has a great graphic comparing the Beta and the V2. On the Beta, they basically had sheets of carbon going north to south that didn't have anything blocking them this way, so basically the foam could just flow seamlessly into the handle. On the V2, there's basically extra carbon here closing off those sheets or those tubes or whatever you want to call them, so basically that means that the foam can't flow freely into the handle. So yes, this might look like a similar paddle to the Beta, but there are clearly some major changes going on here, and I'm gonna be honest, I noticed them as soon as I stepped out onto the court, so let's get into it. What blew me away most on the original Beta Ripple wasn't its power, it wasn't even its insane spin, although that was a big part of it. It was actually its exceptional ball feel. There was something extremely special about the way that paddle pocketed the ball. It was a long dwell time, as you would expect from a foam power paddle, but it also had this very unique, well-defined springiness that provided so much feedback. It almost felt like the ball came off the paddle face with a crackle, and I said in that review it was the closest feel I'd ever had to a tennis racket on a pickleball paddle, and I maintain that to this day. And unfortunately, that feel isn't quite the same on the V2. I don't know exactly why, but this has a more standard feel to it. Now, when I say that, it's certainly not bad, but this feels more along the lines of what we get from other foam power paddles. It's still bouncy and feels like the dwell time adds spring effect onto the ball, and it was always going to feel that way with this core's technology, but it's a bit more hollow, a bit more muted. That really unique feedback isn't there anymore. I think this is because of that reinforcement area with the carbon basically stopping the foam from flowing seamlessly into the handle. On the Beta, there wasn't anything cutting off the foam down there, so every bit of feedback and vibration would make its way down into the handle and then into your hand. And now that there's basically a wall there, there is something altering the feel. At least that's my theory. Now, am I disappointed by that? Yes, at first I definitely was. I'm not gonna pretend like I wasn't. I hit my first few dinks and I was like, yeah, this isn't anything like the original Beta Ripple. But then as this paddle started breaking in over the course of the next few sessions, it did start to feel a little bit better. So I'm gonna talk about that now. It's still not quite that same ultra connected feel of the Beta, but as it breaks in, the dwell time gets a little longer, which adds more feedback, and I did come to appreciate that feel more over time. Now, one of the small issues that I had on the Beta Ripple, if you even want to call it that, was that the sweet spot was pretty small. Obviously, ripples only come in 14 millimeters, and thinner cores have smaller sweet spots, so that was part of it. But there was also definitely something about the way this core was designed that made for a bigger drop-off in playability off-center compared to even other foam power paddles. Now, I was totally fine with that because its feel in the actual sweet spot was so excellent, and sometimes a stark difference in feel between what's in the sweet spot and what's outside of it can actually be a good thing. If a paddle rewards you with good feel in the sweet spot, then it makes you want to hit that every time. And that's kind of where I got to with the Beta Ripple. I knew exactly where to hit it to get the best response off the paddle face, so I was rarely making contact off center. The sweet spot is still fairly small on the Ripple V2, again, compared to other foam power paddles, but because the feel isn't quite as good, I'm just not as confident with it. I'm a little bit more hesitant. Sometimes I make contact early, sometimes a little bit late. I'm trying to feel my way into the paddle, so my contact isn't always perfect, basically. So that's where the smallish sweet spot can be a bit punishing. Of course, you can add weight to the sides to boost stability, which effectively expands your sweet spot, but like I said earlier, the swing weight's already very high, so you don't want to add too much, and you probably want to keep that lead lower down the paddle. I've added about 4 grams to the throat on either side, which is probably actually a little bit too much for this paddle, but I did really want to boost that stability. Now, they probably can't do this because of approval issues, but I would be really curious to see what a 16 millimeter Ripple would play like. I know I've been a little bit negative about the feel, but that's more compared to the Beta Ripple. The feel is still excellent here, and I think with a little bit more dwell time, and especially with that bigger sweet spot we'd get with a 16 millimeter paddle, it could be awesome. But anyways, that's it for the feel and the sweet spot. I know for those of you who watched my Beta Ripple review, you were probably very curious to see what I had to say about those exact characteristics. They're definitely not the same as on the Beta Ripple. But you know what? That paddle was illegal, so they had to change it. Now let's talk about power, because it's still off the charts here. Power is extremely high on the Ripple V2. In fact, this might be the most powerful paddle on the market at this point. It's a little bit less powerful than the Beta, although the difference is super marginal. It's quite a bit less powerful than the Gen 3 Yolas and the Gearbox Pro Powers, especially when those were broken in. But compared to currently legal paddles, this is right up there. Now that's obviously a good thing, especially for those of you who felt like power went down a little bit too much recently on these new legal paddles. I personally think they're all still plenty powerful, but this is, I guess you could say, the smallest drop in power from illegal paddle to new legal paddle. I do think pop is a little bit more impressive than top end power on this paddle. It has a very instantaneously springy feel because it's thinner, but then thicker foam paddles do sometimes have a little bit more trampoline effect to them. Top end power is super high here, but it doesn't have quite as much of that dwell time to load up on power compared to, say, something like a broken in Ultimate. So I would still give the edge in top end power to some other paddles. Whether this gets more powerful after even more break-in, I kind of doubt, but I will talk about durability at the end of the video. Now the high swing weight here, especially on the R1 Ripple, definitely adds to that power as well. More weight up there means more mass crushing into the ball, and that helps more with top end power than it does with pop. To benefit from a high swing weight, you do have to get the paddle face moving pretty quickly through the air, so it does take some effort to tap into that, but on serves and on ground strokes where you have the time to generate a full stroke, you can hit huge shots. Then the R2 and the R4 are both top tier for power and pop in their shape category, especially the R2, which has a really high swing weight for a standard length paddle. There's not a ton more to say about power. I'll let the clips speak for themselves, especially these overheads. This amount of bounce and spring off of an overhead is something I really appreciate, and this is one of the best paddles for that right now. Obviously, when a paddle is super powerful, you gotta find a way to control it. And with these high-powered foam paddles, you can usually do that because they also generate a lot of spin. Spin also happened to be pretty much the best thing about the original Beta Ripple. It was and still is the most spin-friendly paddle I've ever tested, so that was a big part of the magic there, and I was really hoping this would be close, if not potentially higher. It's not. The spin is noticeably lower here on the V2, which, yeah, again, it is a little bit disappointing, and it goes back to what I was saying about that somewhat hollow and muted feel. It feels like this paddle isn't quite digging into the ball the same way that the Beta did, which hurts it both in terms of top-end spin and in the soft spin game. I am looking to get one of those radar guns that tests RPMs to actually back up these spin claims. Don't worry, if I do that, I'll use those numbers more to supplement what I actually feel on court, because I know you guys like what I say in terms of the actual feel. But yeah, less spin, which is okay on ground strokes. I didn't feel like I lacked too much depth control here, although I sometimes did send the ball flying. The issue was more in the soft spin game. One of the things I said in the Beta Ripple review was that that paddle made me feel like a wizard, where I could almost create new shots because it responded so well to different technique in different situations. An example of that would be if I was, say, chasing a drop shot or a short ball, and I would just hit one of the deftest, like low dipping passing shots past my opponent. That paddle basically made it feel like I could grab and shape the ball unlike anything else. That was mainly because of its combination of incredible feel and incredible spin, and because those two things aren't quite as good here, that wizard potential just isn't the same. I just don't feel like I've got the same command of its spin no matter the circumstances, which is less of an issue from the baseline, more of an issue when you need extreme precision on a spin shot. And again, like I've been saying throughout this review, I may mention something isn't quite as special as it was on the Beta, but it's still great. Spin is very high here compared to most paddles, but I will say it is actually a notch under the Pro 4s or even a properly customized True Foam Genesis. Control is always a tricky one on foam power paddles, because on one hand, they're not the most inherently controlled paddles, especially if you look at control as the opposite of power. Because these paddles add a spring effect, they do sort of naturally just pop the ball up, but at this point, a lot of us have played with these paddles, a lot of us are used to their feel, so we're not necessarily surprised by that power anymore. We've sort of adapted our dinking technique to this more powerful response, and there's a serious upside to foam in the control game that hasn't always been talked about all that much: dwell time. Foam adds dwell time. Longer dwell time means that the ball spends longer in the paddle face, which means you have more time to feel it and control it. Just because that dwell time adds power doesn't take away from the fact you have more time. And good players can benefit from that extra time they get to feel the ball, especially on touch shots. Whether it's with dinks, resets, drops, whatever it may be, I actually feel more control with power paddles like these because I have better ball feel with them. Now the question is, how does the Ripple V2 stack up to the competition? Well, this paddle's 14 millimeters, so a little bit less dwell time than average for a power paddle, and it's also, like I said, a little bit hollow and muted, so the feel isn't the best. Unfortunately, feel and dwell time are extremely important for control if it's not a soft paddle, so that puts the Ripple a little bit lower than paddles like the Pro 4s and the Pro Ultimate for me. And the other downside is the sweet spot size. Having a bigger, more forgiving sweet spot is almost always a positive in the control game, which I learned at the Nerdy Tourney playing more high-level doubles, by the way. So the sweet spot being smaller here also takes away from its control. Basically, you're not buying a Ripple V2 to get the best controlled paddle on the market, which I'm sure most of you were expecting, but the main thing to understand here is that even relative to other paddles in its category, it is pretty low for control. Now obviously, control will always improve when you add lead tape to the sides, which is another reason why I have so much here, but you always have to keep in mind with this paddle that the swing weight is already extremely high out of the box, so let's talk maneuverability. I did quickly want to touch on maneuverability before getting into durability because it's very important here, especially on the R1 Ripple. That 124 stock swing weight makes this a very clunky paddle, and the balance is also quite concentrated towards the head, so you don't get great hand speed and it doesn't feel great for that flicking motion. There's also something really annoying here that adds to that lack of maneuverability: the handle. It's thin and it's super squishy. I don't know why, but that is really annoying. The problem with a super squishy handle like this is that it makes the paddle feel less responsive because it's not as solid in your hand. From a company who's been making some of the best handles on the market for years now, I'm really surprised, and I have to say I do not understand why it's like this on the Ripple, but I do wish this had a more premium feeling handle. Now the R2 and the R4 are obviously much more maneuverable than the R1, but the R2, compared to other paddles in its category, has a much higher swing weight. So it's actually not that maneuverable compared to paddles you should be comparing it to. The R4 is definitely the most normal feeling in terms of maneuverability when you compare it to other paddles in its shape category, so you should go for that one if you want the properties of the Ripple, you know you want a hybrid paddle, and you don't want any extra surprises. Now let's talk durability, because that was obviously quite a contentious issue with foam power paddles, but durability has gotten quite a bit better since they first released last year. Ronbus is also a company that's always prided itself on good durability, and I do trust they've done their homework with this paddle. I've played probably around 25 hours with it, and it's broken in. It's definitely not exactly the same as it was new, but it was a very gradual process, and it's not a huge playability change from new to now. It's just got a little bit more dwell time, and it is a tiny bit more powerful. To be honest, I actually prefer it right now, but I don't see it having a huge change in playability like there was on the Gen 3 Yolas, for example. One thing I want to make very clear is that despite some of my qualms with the Ripple V2, this is still an excellent pickleball paddle. It's got great feel, great spin, top tier power, and good control if you know what you're getting into. It's just not quite as special as the Beta Ripple that I tested back in August, but then again, this paddle's actually legal. Unfortunately, the rules are what they are, and that playability isn't allowed right now, so it makes sense that this doesn't perform quite as well, and that's okay, that's the parameters they're working within. Now obviously, power paddles like this are a know what you're getting into type thing. Power is the main character here, and this paddle does not help you out at all in the touch game, which is the most important part of pickleball. Because of that, beginners and intermediates should not consider this paddle. It's just too punishing, especially because it's 14 millimeters and it has a really high swing weight. For those of you who want high power and especially high pop for hand battles and put-away volleys, this is one of the best paddles out there right now. It's definitely not a quick paddle because of its high swing weight, but it is thin, so it is fairly aerodynamic, and that inherently poppy feel is going to win you points by itself anyways. I do think there are more well-rounded power paddles at this point. I think the Pro 4s have a bit more feel and spin, and if you do consider the True Foam Genesis paddles to be power paddles, then those have significantly more control. I am happy they finally got a Ripple out to the market though. The engineers at Ronbus do things very well, so they definitely deserve this. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these new Ronbus Ripple V2s, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.